No extra food, my daughter-in-law said, sliding a single glass of water toward me while the rest of the table shimmered under candlelight and silverware. Her words sliced through the soft jazz playing overhead. The waiter froze, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Marissa smiled, that polished, camera-ready smile of hers, the one that always hides the venom. Just water for her, she added lightly. She's not really part of this dinner. I looked at my son Michael, hoping to find even a flicker of protest. Instead, he nodded as if starving his mother was a reasonable request. Mom already ate, he told the waiter, eyes fixed on his wineglass. My throat tightened, but I said nothing. The waiter's pen trembled, then he wrote down the order: 4 lobster thermidors. Not 5. Just 4. The scent of melted butter floated through the air, as laughter from other tables mingled with the clinking of glasses. I sat still, hands folded neatly in my lap, pretending not to notice the looks. I could have spoken. I could have told them that every chandelier above us, every polished tile beneath our feet existed because of me. But I didn't. Not yet. I just smiled faintly and whispered, one word. Noted. Marissa blinked, momentarily thrown off. Perhaps she expected outrage, maybe a tear, maybe a scene she could later twist into a family story about her difficult mother-in-law. Instead, I gave her calm. Calm, always unsettled, cruel people more than anger. The waiter left quickly, relieved to escape the tension. The family resumed their small talk, pretending I wasn't there. I sipped the water, cold and clean, feeling it travel down my throat like a line of ice. They talked about vacations and promotions, about Marissa's new car, about the neighborhood gala she'd been invited to host. Her parents praised her for everything. My son nodded proudly beside her. I listened, invisible. The restaurant sparkled around us, the soft murmur of wealth laughter echoing under crystal lights. It wasn't the kind of place you visit on a whim. A single entree cost more than what I used to make in a week cleaning other people's homes. Yet, somehow, I was here in a pearl gray dress I'd worn to Michael's graduation 10 years ago. I'd pressed it carefully that morning, hoping to look presentable, respectable, motherly. When the waiter returned with their wine, Marissa took the first sip and smiled in approval. Excellent choice, she said. Her tone was meant for the audience she imagined around her, not for us. Everything she did carried that unspoken tagline, look at me, I belong here. She leaned closer to Michael and whispered something that made him chuckle. I caught fragments of her words, so simple, so old-fashioned, I told you. Her mother laughed softly. The sound scraped against my nerves like a fork on glass. I stared at my reflection in the glass of water, soft gray hair, pinned neatly, faint lines on my face, hands that had scrubbed floors, kneaded dough, lifted boxes, comforted a crying child. Those hands had built a life for the man now sitting across from me, pretending not to see me. Marissa raised her glass. To family, she said, her voice syrupy sweet. To knowing our place. Michael raised his glass too. To family, he echoed. I lifted my water, met her eyes, and said softly, indeed. Knowing our place. The words hung in the air, heavier than anyone expected. Marissa's smile flickered just for a second before she regained control. The waiter appeared again, setting down small plates of bread and butter, 4 plates. He hesitated before skipping my side. It's fine, I told him quietly. Don't worry. He nodded, guilt coloring his young face. For a moment I wanted to comfort him, to say it wasn't his fault. But I stayed silent. Manners had always been my armor. Even now, surrounded by cruelty disguised as etiquette, I refused to let them see me break. Marissa's father cleared his throat. Michael tells us you live alone now, Mrs. Matthews. Retirement treating you well, Gloria, I corrected gently. Please call me Gloria. And yes, I enjoy the quiet. Marissa's mother smiled too widely. That's wonderful. So many people your age struggle, you know, without savings, without stability. The way she said it, like she was complimenting a stray dog for surviving another winter, made something deep inside me shift. But still, I smiled. Yes, I said. I'm very fortunate. The conversation drifted back to them, to renovations, investments, club memberships. I faded into the background, an old photograph propped in the corner of a lively room. Michael avoided my eyes. He hadn't looked at me directly since I walked in. I remembered the way he used to, how his gaze once carried admiration, pride, love. Now it carried discomfort, maybe shame. Marissa laughed at something her father said. Her jewelry sparkled under the chandelier, each movement deliberate. Everything about her was performance. I'd worked in enough dining rooms to recognize that particular hunger, the kind that isn't for food but for validation. The lobsters arrived 10 minutes later, steaming and golden, glistening with butter. The smell filled the air, intoxicating, rich. The waiter placed the dishes in front of them carefully. 4 perfect plates. My space in front of me remained empty except for the condensation pooling beneath the glass. Marissa cracked her lobster shell with delicate precision, dipped the meat in butter and closed her eyes as though savoring something divine. "This place never disappoints," she murmured. I didn't move. My hands stayed folded on my lap. I didn't even reach for the water anymore. The sound of their laughter, their forks tapping porcelain, the hum of conversation from other tables all blurred into a dull, distant roar. It was almost peaceful. Marissa glanced at me. "Everything okay, Gloria?" she asked sweetly. "You're so quiet." "I'm just observing," I replied. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Observing? How interesting." She looked at her mother. "See, I told you, she's always calm." Yes, her mother agreed. She has that humble energy. That word again. Humble. I'd been called that my entire life, always by people who wanted to remind me that humility was the only thing they'd ever allow me to own. But they were wrong. I owned more than humility. I owned this moment even if they didn't know it yet. The young waiter returned once more, clearing crumbs, refilling their wine. He looked at me again, hesitant. Our eyes met. For a second, recognition flashed in his expression. He gave the tiniest nod, respectful knowing. I smiled back just enough for him to understand, not yet. Marissa's father laughed loudly at his own joke, drowning out the quiet exchange. I barely heard him. My focus was elsewhere, on the ticking clock above the bar, the rhythm of knives against plates, the way everything felt meticulously timed. I could feel it, something shifting in the air. Marissa lifted her glass of wine and said, "To success, to the future, and to knowing where we belong." This time I didn't hesitate. I raised my water, my smile soft but deliberate. "To belonging," I said. They didn't notice the double meaning. They never did. Outside, the rain began to fall against the tall glass windows, thin streaks gliding down like silent witnesses. Inside, I sat in a world they believed they owned, unaware that it had always been mine. I listened to the laughter fade in and out, my heartbeat steady, my expression unreadable. I stayed still because stillness made people reveal themselves. And they had. Marissa looked so sure of her place at that table, surrounded by her family, her wealth, her illusion of power. But she hadn't yet realized that power doesn't come from money or titles. It comes from knowing when to stay quiet, and when to finally speak. That time hadn't come. Not yet. I finished the last sip of water, set the glass down gently, and smiled to myself. They thought I was beneath them. They didn't know they were sitting at my table. When I got home that night, I hung my gray dress on the back of the chair, and stared at it for a long time. The fabric still smelled faintly of butter and perfume, a cruel reminder of the dinner that wasn't mine. My hands, wrinkled and calloused from years of work, trembled slightly as I smoothed the creases. For a moment, I thought about throwing it away. Instead, I folded it carefully and laid it across the arm of the couch. Some things I decided were better kept as evidence. I boiled water for tea and watched the kettle steam, the quiet hiss filling my small apartment. Outside, the city lights blinked against the wet streets of Seattle. Inside, the silence pressed against me, but it didn't feel empty, it felt earned. I sat down with my tea and stared at my reflection in the dark window. The woman looking back at me wasn't weak. She was tired, yes, but there was steel in her eyes that even humiliation couldn't dull. I used to think hard work was a guarantee of love. That if you gave enough, sacrificed enough life, or at least your child would reward you with gratitude. I was wrong. But that lesson hadn't started tonight. It started 35 years ago when I became a mother on my own. Michael was 5 when his father left. No warning, no explanation, just a note on the kitchen table and a bank account that read 0. I remember standing at that same table holding the note in one hand and my son's little fingers in the other, trying not to cry. He looked up at me with big confused eyes and said, "It's okay, Mom, you still have me." I promised him then that it would be enough. I didn't know what that promise would cost. I worked wherever they'd have me. In the mornings I cleaned motel rooms. In the afternoons I took shifts at a diner down by Elliott Bay, scrubbing pans and peeling potatoes until my hands cracked. At night I cooked in other people's kitchens, learning recipes I couldn't afford to eat. Sometimes I'd come home after midnight, my uniform smelling of onions and bleach, and find Michael asleep on the couch with his homework still open. I'd cover him with a blanket and whisper, "One day, sweetheart, this will all be worth it." When I finally saved enough, I enrolled in a night course for culinary arts. I thought if I could just learn more, maybe I could climb out of the cycle of survival. I'd study in the break room while the younger waitresses laughed about their weekends. They didn't understand why a woman in her 30s would still chase dreams instead of rest. But I wasn't chasing a dream, I was building a foundation. Michael grew up watching me work myself raw. He never complained, but I saw the guilt in his eyes sometimes. When other kids talked about family vacations, he'd shrug and say, "My mom's saving for my college." And I was. Every dollar I earned had his name written on it. The day he got accepted into the University of Washington, I cried harder than I had when he was born. He hugged me, his face glowing with pride. "Mom," he said, "I'll take care of you one day. You'll never have to work again." I smiled and told him he already had. But promises made in youth are fragile things. Time has a way of bending them until they don't fit anymore. The first time Michael came home from college, I noticed the difference. His clothes were sharper, his words smoother. He'd learned how to hide discomfort behind polite smiles, the same way the people I used to serve did. He told me about his professors, his projects, his new friends. He barely mentioned me. I cooked his favorite dish, roasted chicken with thyme and lemon, but he picked at it distractedly, scrolling through his phone between bites. Still, I told myself it was normal. He was growing, becoming his own man. I didn't want to hold him back. Then came Marissa. He brought her home for the holidays. I remember the knock at the door, a crisp, confident sound. When I opened it, she stood there in a beige coat that looked like it had never known rain. Her perfume filled the doorway before she even spoke. "You must be Mrs. Matthews," she said, smiling like someone posing for a photograph. "Gloria," I corrected automatically. "Come in." Her eyes scanned the apartment, the old furniture, the faded wallpaper, the smell of cinnamon and coffee. "It's cozy," she said finally, which is the word rich people use when they mean small. I served dinner roast chicken again because it was Michael's favorite. She took 2 bites, dabbed her lips with the napkin, and said, "I don't usually eat carbs at night, but this is lovely." I thanked her. She smiled as if she'd just given me an award. When Michael looked at her, I saw the way his shoulders straightened, the way he mirrored her tone. He was proud of her, the way I used to think he was proud of me. It shouldn't have hurt, but it did. After dinner, while Michael washed the dishes, Marissa joined me in the kitchen. She glanced at the fridge covered in old magnets and Michael's childhood drawings now yellow with age. "Michael told me you used to cook for a living," she said. "I still do," I answered, in a different way. "That's admirable," she said, her eyes drifting to the peeling paint on the cabinet. "But it must have been exhausting." "It was worth it," I told her. She smiled that practiced smile again. "Well, you can rest now. You've done your part." She didn't understand that rest wasn't the reward I wanted. Respect was. A few months later, they married. The wedding was elegant, the kind of event where champagne flows like water and laughter hides judgment. I remember sitting at a table near the back, surrounded by strangers, watching my son toast his new family. He looked happy, radiant. When he thanked everyone who made me who I am today, his eyes never met mine. After that, visits became less frequent. Calls turned into texts turned into silence. When he did reach out, it was always rushed. "Everything's good, Mom. We'll catch up soon." I learned to fill the silence with work again. I opened my first restaurant 5 years after his wedding, a small place by the harbor called Marbella's. No one knew it belonged to me. I preferred it that way. I wanted to see who people were when they thought I was ordinary. But tonight, sitting in that same restaurant in that same gray dress, I realized how perfectly life had circled back. My son and his wife had looked at me as if I were a guest in a place I built. Maybe that was the final test. Maybe I had let the world think I was less for so long that even my own child believed it. I stood up and walked to the window. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening like wet glass. The tea on the table had gone cold, but I didn't mind. I felt strangely calm. People think breaking points come with shouting or tears, but sometimes they arrive as a whisper in your chest, a quiet certainty that something has ended. Tonight I'd reached mine. I walked to the mirror by the door and looked at myself again. The woman staring back wasn't the servant they thought she was. She was the architect of their comfort, the invisible foundation beneath their luxury. They thought they fed me humiliation, I whispered. But I've been swallowing pride my whole life. And it only made me stronger. Tomorrow I would wake early. There was work to do. The kind that doesn't feed resentment, but reveals truth. Because some lessons can't be taught with words, they must be served hot under the brightest light in the room. The first time I saw Marissa, she was standing in my kitchen like she owned it. Michael had brought her home on a rainy Friday afternoon, his arm wrapped around her shoulders as if to shield her from a world that didn't deserve her. She stepped inside without hesitation, beige heels clicking against the old linoleum floor, the scent of her perfume cutting through the familiar warmth of cinnamon and coffee that usually filled my apartment. "You must be Mrs. Matthews," she said, smiling perfectly, each word polished, smooth. "Gloria the First," replied, wiping my hands on my apron. "Welcome." Her eyes drifted over everything, the faded curtains, the mismatched mugs, the faint hum of the old refrigerator. "It's cozy," she said, finally, her tone light but her eyes sharp. I'd heard that tone before. Years of working in fine dining had trained me to recognize polite disdain hidden behind sweet words. Michael stood beside her, proud and glowing. "Isn't she amazing, Mom? Marissa just closed her first big deal this month." I smiled because mothers are expected to smile. "That's wonderful," I said. She held out a box of macarons, the kind that look too delicate to eat. "A little something for you," she said. "From a French bakery downtown." "I didn't know what you liked." "Anything's fine," I told her. "I'm easy to please." She laughed softly. "I can tell." I felt the words like a paper cut, small, easy to dismiss, but sharp enough to sting. That evening I cooked dinner, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, salad with lemon dressing. Simple, comforting home. The smells filled the air, but I noticed the way she wrinkled her nose when I set the dishes down. She ate slowly, politely, barely tasting. "It's delicious," she said, though her plate remained nearly full. Michael ate eagerly, talking about work, about clients, about things that felt foreign to the world we once shared. "Marissa's parents lived in Bellevue," he said. "Her father owned a real estate firm. Her mother managed philanthropy events." The words rolled off his tongue like they belonged to another language entirely, one he was desperate to master. After dinner, Marissa stood up to help me clear the table. "You don't have to," I said, but she waved me off. "Of course. I insist." We worked side by side in silence for a moment. Then she spoke casually, like she was commenting on the weather. "Michael told me you used to cook in restaurants. That must have been interesting." "It was," I said, rinsing a plate. "I learned a lot about people from kitchens." She smiled faintly. "I imagine it must be hard work. Not many could do that for so long." "I enjoyed it," I said simply. "It taught me patience." Marissa tilted her head, her eyes glinting. "Patience," she repeated softly, as if trying to measure the word. "That's a rare quality. I hope you're ready to rest now." "Rest, yes," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "Michael's doing so well. You don't have to work anymore." "Isn't that a relief?" I met her gaze and smiled. "I rest when I'm done building." "Building what?" she asked, half amused. "Legacy," I said. Her expression flickered for just a second, something between confusion and discomfort. Then she laughed, airy and bright. How poetic. Later that night, after they left, I stood in my kitchen and felt the echo of her perfume still hanging in the air. It smelled expensive, like something that would never mix with the scent of garlic or coffee. I poured myself a glass of water and sat down at the table. There was a lipstick stain on one of the cups she'd used. It felt like a mark left by a stranger who'd already decided where she fit in the hierarchy of our lives. The next morning, Michael called. "She really likes you, Mom," he said. "Does she?" I asked. "Of course." She said, "You remind her of her aunt, quiet, practical, very down to earth." Down to earth. Another phrase that sounds like praise, but feels like a pat on the head. "Michael," I said softly, "do you love her?" He laughed. "Of course I do. She's everything I ever wanted." I didn't argue. It wasn't my place to ruin his happiness. But as I hung up, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything he ever wanted didn't include me anymore. Months passed. Marissa became a constant presence, at first through phone calls, then visits, then holidays that she planned with military precision. Thanksgiving was at her parents' house now, not mine. Christmas too. She always invited me, of course, but the invitations came through Michael's quick, impersonal texts. "Dinner at 7. Dress nicely." Every time I went, she greeted me like a guest she barely remembered. "Gloria, how lovely you could make it." Her hugs were light, rehearsed, never warm. I'd bring a dish, something homemade, something that carried history. She'd thank me sweetly, then place it on the farthest corner of the table. Her mother would whisper something about presentation, and they'd both laugh. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. Families evolve. Roles shift. But every smile, every perfectly polite word from her reminded me that she saw me as a relic, something quaint to keep in the background, not someone to listen to. The last real conversation we had was a few weeks before the dinner that changed everything. She had stopped by my apartment to drop off a dress she thought I might enjoy wearing. It was lovely, soft beige silk, but 2 sizes too small. "I thought of you when I saw it," she said. "It's beautiful," I replied, holding it up. "But it won't fit." Marissa smiled, unbothered. "Maybe it will motivate you." I looked at her, the dress, then back again. "Motivate me to what?" "To keep up," she said lightly. "You know, with all the changes." When she left, I folded the dress neatly and placed it back in the box. I never wore it, but that day I understood something vital. She wasn't trying to connect with me. She was trying to erase me. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me patient. People like Marissa always reveal themselves, eventually. The challenge is knowing when to stop explaining your worth and start letting the world show it for you. A week later, Michael called with a voice I hadn't heard in months, soft, almost apologetic. "Mom, Marissa wants to have dinner with you. Just us. She thinks we've been distant." I felt hope flicker in my chest, but only for a second. "Just us? Well, her parents might join." "But it's casual," he said. "She made a reservation at Marbella's." The name hit me like a small current. "My restaurant." I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Marbella's, you say? That's a fine place." "Yeah," he said, sounding relieved. "She wanted something elegant. She says it'll be good for us to reconnect." "Of course," I replied softly. "It will be." After I hung up, I stood in my kitchen again, surrounded by quiet. The air smelled of coffee flour and a faint trace of the perfume she'd left behind weeks earlier. I touched the edge of the table where Michael used to do his homework, remembering the boy who once promised to buy me a big house. I didn't need a big house anymore. I already owned something far more valuable, the truth. When the clock struck 10, I turned off the lights and sat by the window watching the rain fall on the street below. In the reflection of the glass, I saw my own face and whispered, "Let's see what kind of dinner they plan to serve." Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the city like a quiet warning. Inside, I sat very still, calm as ever. Patience had always been my sharpest knife, and tomorrow it would cut clean. The invitation came a week later, tucked inside a white envelope with gold trim and my name written in perfect cursive, Mrs. Gloria Matthews. Marissa's handwriting graceful, sharp, and practiced. Inside a printed card read, "Dinner at Marbella's Friday at 7:30 p.m. Family only." The last two words glimmered faintly under the restaurant's embossed logo. Family only. I smiled when I read that. How poetic. Michael called that evening, his voice unusually gentle. "Mom, Marissa really wants to fix things. She feels bad about how distant we've been." "I see," I said, stirring sugar into my tea. "And she thought a dinner would help. She thinks it'll be good for all of us." A fresh start. A fresh start. I'd heard that phrase before. It usually meant someone wanted to start over without cleaning up the mess they'd made. Still, I agreed. "Of course, darling. I'll be there." He sounded relieved. "Thank you, Mom. Dress nicely, okay? It's a nice place." "Oh, I know," I said, softly smiling to myself. "I know it very well." When Friday arrived, I stood in front of my closet for nearly 20 minutes. I chose the same pearl gray dress I'd worn to Michael's graduation years ago. It had always been my lucky dress, the one that made me feel proud, not rich or powerful, but accomplished. I pinned my hair neatly, added a touch of lipstick, and slipped on my black heels. Modest, graceful, timeless. The mirror reflected a woman who had been underestimated her whole life and had learned to use it. I took a cab downtown. As we approached the restaurant, I could see the golden letters of the sign glowing against the Seattle night Marbellas. My heart swelled, not with pride but with something deeper: ownership. Everything about the place felt familiar, intimate. The scent of rosemary and garlic wafting through the air. The way the soft jazz spilled gently onto the sidewalk. My restaurant. My world. The hostess greeted me at the door with a professional smile. "Good evening, ma'am. Do you have a reservation table 22?" I said. "Under Matthews." Her smile widened, though her tone stayed formal. "Of course, Mrs. Matthews. They're already here. Right this way." The dining room glowed with low amber light. Crystal chandeliers hung above polished marble floors. Every table had a single white rose in a glass vase. I noticed the familiar staff moving briskly between tables, the same faces that had worked for me for years. They didn't recognize me at first. I'd kept my ownership discreet, letting my general manager Dario handle the front. But as I walked by, one of the waiters glanced up startled. His eyes widened in recognition. I gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not yet. Marissa saw me first. She was radiant, of course, always radiant. Her beige dress shimmered under the light, her hair styled into soft waves. Michael sat beside her, looking proud but slightly nervous. Across from them were Marissa's parents, dressed in quiet luxury, her father in a tailored navy suit, her mother dripping in pearls. "Gloria," Marissa exclaimed, rising from her seat. "You look lovely." "Thank you," I said, taking the only empty chair slightly off to the side near the corner. A position chosen carefully, no doubt. "You're a bit late," she said, glancing at her watch. "The traffic was terrible," I replied, setting my purse on my lap. The waiter appeared with menus, sleek black leather with gold lettering. Marissa didn't open hers. She waved her manicured hand. "We'll all have the lobster thermidor," she said. "The large ones, please. And your best white wine." The waiter nodded, jotting notes. "4 lobsters," Michael said quietly. "Not 5. Marissa frowned, confused. "What do you mean, not 5? He gestured toward me without meeting my eyes. "Mom already ate before she came." Marissa blinked, then smiled as if she'd just remembered something trivial. "Oh, right. Just water for her then." The waiter hesitated. His eyes darted to mine. I smiled gently. "Water's fine." He nodded and hurried away. Marissa's parents resumed their conversation, chatting about travel and real estate investments, as if nothing strange had happened. Marissa leaned back in her chair, her smile flawless, her tone honeyed. "I'm so glad we're all here together. It feels symbolic." "It does," I said quietly. "Very symbolic." Michael shifted uncomfortably. "Let's just enjoy the night, okay?" "I'm enjoying it," Marissa said, lightly lifting her glass of wine. "A toast to family and to knowing our place in it." Her mother chuckled softly. "Well said." I raised my glass of water. "To knowing our place," I echoed. For a moment she faltered. Then she smiled again, wider than before. The lobsters arrived soon after, steaming, glistening with butter and herbs. The smell was intoxicating. 4 enormous plates placed neatly in front of them, each more extravagant than the last. The waiter, nervous, placed the water in front of me last. A clear glass half-filled, condensation dripping down the sides. Marissa cracked her shell, delicately dipped the meat into butter, and closed her eyes. "Exquisite," she murmured. "This place never disappoints." Her father nodded. "The quality is remarkable." I stayed silent, watching. Her mother leaned forward, her voice laced with faint sympathy. "It must be difficult, Gloria, not having a stable income now that you're retired. These times aren't kind to people your age." Michael cleared his throat. "Mom gets by fine." "Of course," Marissa said sweetly, her eyes gleaming. "We all do what we can with what we have. Though, well, some of us have more than others." Silence fell. Only the soft clatter of silverware filled the air. Her father smiled tightly, lifting his glass. "To success," he said. "To the future." They all raised their glasses. I didn't move. My water sat untouched. The ice had begun to melt. Marissa turned to me again. "You've always been so humble, Gloria. It's admirable, really. Some people spend their whole lives chasing what they can't have. But you seem content." I met her gaze calmly. "Contentment isn't a lack of ambition, dear. It's knowing when you already have enough." She tilted her head, still smiling. Such wisdom. Her mother leaned forward again. "Tell me, dear, do you still work, or are you finally retired?" I opened my mouth to respond, but Marissa answered for me. "She does a little bit of everything, cleaning, cooking, that sort of thing. Honest work." The way she said honest work made the air colder. "Admirable," her father said. "Hard work should always be respected." Though of course we made sure Marissa never had to struggle like that. "Of course," I said softly, folding my hands in my lap. For the next hour I listened. They spoke about investments, art, philanthropy, about everything they believed made them superior. I sat quietly, nodding when appropriate, invisible and watching. Marissa's mother sipped her wine. "It's important to set boundaries, especially with family. You know, people who might expect too much." "Exactly," Marissa said. "Michael and I were just saying that it's best to maintain space. Keeps everyone happier." I felt the words land one by one, but I refused to flinch. "Space is good," I said. "It gives people time to reveal themselves." Her smile faltered just slightly. When the desserts came, 4 plates of tiramisu, I stayed still. The waiter hovered awkwardly with a 5th plate in his hand before Marissa said, "Oh, she's fine. Just water." The waiter placed the dessert back on his tray and nodded apologetically. Marissa lifted her fork, eyes gleaming under the chandelier. "You understand, don't you, Gloria? It's not personal. It's just our lifestyle. Appearances matter. You wouldn't want anyone to misunderstand." I smiled faintly. "No, of course not. I understand perfectly." And I did. I understood everything. They thought I was there to eat. They didn't realize I was there to observe, to watch them dig their own grave, one polished word at a time. As they laughed and sipped their wine, I glanced at the waiter across the room. He caught my eye, recognition flickering again. I gave him a quiet nod. His posture straightened. Soon, Marissa dabbed her lips with a napkin. "This has been wonderful," she said. "Truly. I think we've cleared the air." "Yes," I said softly. "The air is very clear now." I reached for my purse, stood up and smiled. "If you'll excuse me, I need to use the restroom." "Of course," Marissa said, already glancing at her phone. I turned and walked toward the hallway leading to the kitchen. My heels clicked steadily against the marble floor. I could feel their eyes on my back, but I didn't look back. They thought I was walking away in defeat. They didn't know I was walking home. The hallway stretched out in front of me like a tunnel between 2 worlds, the one where I was treated like an inconvenience, and the one where my real life waited behind a steel door marked staff only. The sound of the dining room faded with every step I took, replaced by the rhythm of pots clanging, knives tapping against cutting boards, and voices shouting orders in Spanish and Italian. The smell of garlic butter and charred lemon filled the air, familiar and comforting. I pushed the door open and the noise swallowed me whole. It was chaos, controlled, precise chaos. Steam rose in white clouds, and the hum of the industrial vents drowned out everything else. My heels clicked against the tile, an alien sound in a place where rubber soles usually ruled. "Mrs. Matthews," a voice called from near the stove. I turned to see Dario, my head chef, towering over a pan of simmering sauce. His salt and pepper hair was pulled back, his apron already stained with the colors of the evening rush. The moment he saw me, his expression softened into concern. He wiped his hands quickly and came over. "Madonna mia," he muttered, lowering his voice. "You're here. I saw you in the dining room. With those people." I was about to go out and I raised a hand to stop him. "It's all right, Dario. I needed to see something for myself." He frowned, his eyes narrowing. "You looked like you hadn't eaten." "They didn't serve you, they served me plenty," I said calmly. "Just, not food." He stared at me for a moment, then nodded slowly. He'd worked for me long enough to understand my tone, measured, steady, but hiding something sharp beneath. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. "Nothing yet," I said, scanning the room. The stainless steel counters gleamed, the staff moving like clockwork around each other. Every detail was perfect, exactly as I'd trained them. "Just keep everything running. When I come back through that door, follow me after 3 minutes." He tilted his head. "And what should I call you when I do?" I smiled faintly. "What you always do." Dario's grin appeared slowly. "Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Matthews." I nodded. "Good. Let's give them a dinner they'll remember." He chuckled under his breath. Always the calm before the storm. As he turned back to his stove, I took a slow walk along the line, watching the staff at work. Some of them noticed me, their faces lighting up with recognition and respect. I'd built this kitchen from nothing. It had once been an empty shell, with peeling paint and rusted pipes. Now it was my empire. Every sound, every smell, every satisfied customer, outside a testament to years of exhaustion, turned into triumph. A young sous chef named Luis stopped chopping onions when he saw me. "Mrs. Matthews," he whispered, bowing his head slightly. "Is everything okay?" "Perfect," I said. "You're doing well tonight. Keep your station tight." He nodded, pride flickering in his eyes. I remembered when he'd first started here, nervous, desperate for a chance. I'd given him one, just like I'd given one to nearly everyone in this kitchen. As I walked further, I thought about all the hands that had shaped this place. The ones who washed dishes to pay for school, the ones who crossed oceans for work, the ones who came here broken and found a new start. This kitchen wasn't just mine, it was a refuge for people who understood that dignity wasn't something given, it was something reclaimed. I stopped near the back where the air was cooler. The hum of the freezers blended with the sizzling pans, a rhythm that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat. Dario came up beside me, quietly holding a tasting spoon. "Try this," he said, offering me a small sip of sauce. White wine reduction, butter, garlic, rosemary. I tasted it, letting the warmth spread across my tongue. "Perfect," I said. He smiled faintly. "You trained me well." We stood in silence for a moment, both of us listening to the symphony of the kitchen. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked suddenly. "Regret what? All of this? The years, the sacrifices, the people who don't know who you really are?" I shook my head. "No. The only thing I ever regret is who I gave everything to without asking if they deserved it." He nodded slowly. "Your son." I met his eyes unflinching. "My son," Dario sighed, wiping his hands on his apron. "He'll learn one day. Pride has a way of teaching those who think they know everything." I smiled faintly. "Maybe tonight." He studied me carefully. "You have that look again. The one you had the day you bought this place." "What look?" "The one that says you're about to change everything." I let out a quiet laugh. "Maybe I am." He laughed too, but softer. "Then I should get ready." I nodded. 3 minutes after I leave. He touched his chest briefly in salute, always. As he walked away, I turned toward the polished steel refrigerator door. My reflection stared back, steady eyes, silver hair, a woman carved from survival. I pressed my fingertips against the cool surface, feeling the hum of the machinery beneath. They think they've humiliated me, I whispered. But I've been building this moment since before they could spell the word respect. The kitchen doors swung open behind me, and the faint sound of laughter drifted in from the dining room. Marissa's voice carried above the others, bright, musical, empty. I adjusted my posture, straightened the small silver pin on my jacket, and turned back toward the line. Dario caught my eye from across the room. He nodded once. As I made my way toward the door, the bustle of the kitchen paused just for a second. Every head turned. Every voice went quiet. "Good evening, Mrs. Matthews," one of the prep cooks said softly, reverently. I smiled. "Good evening, everyone. You're doing beautifully." Their faces lit up, proud and loyal. In that moment, I realized something: no matter what happened out there, I already had my family. They just didn't share my blood. I took one last deep breath, letting the heat of the stoves and the sound of sizzling butter wrap around me. It smelled like home. It always did. "Wish me luck," I said, half to Dario, half to the room. "Luck?" he said, smirking. "You don't need luck, ma'am. You own the place." I smiled at that, turned toward the door and pushed it open. The cool air of the dining room hit me like a soft wave. The light was dimmer here, quieter, filled with murmurs and clinking glasses. In the distance I could see them, Marissa, her parents, and my son, laughing oblivious. My seat was still empty, the glass of water glinting under the chandelier. I took one step forward, then another. Behind me, the kitchen doors swung shut with a whisper. The world I'd built was sealed behind them, waiting for my signal. They had told me to know my place. They were about to learn that I did. And it was higher than any of them could ever imagine. When I stepped back into the dining room, the air felt heavier, like it had been holding its breath while I was gone. The chandeliers glittered above the table, reflecting golden light on Marissa's jewelry and the half-empty wine glasses that sparkled like trophies. My seat was still waiting, the glass of water untouched, a small puddle of condensation spreading across the tablecloth. Marissa looked up, flashing her practiced smile. "Everything all right, Gloria? We were just talking about the new condo. I'm sure it's lovely," I said, taking my seat again. Her mother leaned forward eagerly. "It has a park view, 3 bedrooms, and the most exquisite marble counters. Real Italian marble, not the cheap kind." "How wonderful," I said softly. "You must be proud." Marissa beamed, taking another sip of wine. "Oh, we are. It's the kind of home that shows people who you are, you know, where you belong." I felt the words land like pebbles tossed into a pond. They rippled but didn't sink. "Yes," I said, folding my napkin neatly. "I know exactly what you mean." Michael avoided my eyes. He'd been doing that all evening. I watched him swirl the wine in his glass, the motion, nervous, restless. Her father cleared his throat. "Michael tells us he's being considered for a regional manager position. That's a big step up, son." Michael nodded modestly. "Yes, sir. It's a huge opportunity. I'll be overseeing the West Coast division." "Impressive," Marissa's father said, raising his glass. "But then again, it helps to have the right connections. Family matters, doesn't it?" Marissa smiled at her father, then looked at me. "That's what I keep telling Michael. The right people open the right doors." I tilted my head slightly. "And what happens to the wrong ones?" She blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me, the wrong people," I repeated, "the ones who don't fit into the picture. What happens to them?" Marissa laughed light and dismissive. "You're funny, Gloria." "Sometimes," I said, smiling back. The waiter appeared again to clear the empty dessert plates. He hesitated at my end of the table, unsure whether to reach for the glass of water. I gave him a reassuring nod. "It's all right, Luis," I said quietly. "You're doing fine." He froze for a second, his eyes widening slightly when I said his name. Then he gave a tiny nod, understanding more than anyone else at the table could. He carried the plates away, shoulders straighter than before. Marissa leaned closer to her parents. "Luis, you know the waiter's name?" I smiled. I make a habit of remembering the names of people who bring something to the table. Her mother gave a brittle laugh. How charming. Michael shifted in his chair. Mom, maybe we should. Marissa cut him off with a sweet but sharp tone. No, no. It's nice. Gloria has always been humble. Humble, I echoed. Such a versatile word. Sometimes it means grounded. Other times it means invisible. Marissa's smile faltered, but her mother quickly filled the silence. Well, humility is a virtue. Not everyone can afford to live without it. Her father laughed at that, a deep, smug sound that grated against the piano music drifting from the corner of the room. I sat still, my pulse steady, my thoughts clear. I'd been quiet long enough. Tell me, I said suddenly, my voice gentle but firm, when you invited me tonight, what did you hope to accomplish? Marissa blinked. To reconnect, she said, her tone too quick, too defensive. Reconnect, I repeated. Interesting word. Because from where I'm sitting, it feels more like performance than reconciliation. Michael stiffened. Mom, I didn't look at him. I'm curious, Marissa. What did you want from this dinner? To set boundaries, to remind me of my place? Her mother gasped softly. Her father frowned, but Marissa didn't back down. You're taking this the wrong way, she said, her voice still sweet. We just wanted to help you understand how things are now. You don't have to worry about appearances or expectations. Expectations, I asked. Whose? Ours, she said, the smile tightening around her mouth. Michael and I have worked hard to build a certain kind of life, Gloria. And sometimes, well, certain people don't fit into that world easily. Certain people, I said, tilting my head. Like me. She hesitated just long enough for the truth to show. Please don't take it personally. I see, I said softly. So it's not personal to exclude me from my own son's world. Her father interjected, voice deep and pompous. Now, Mrs. Matthews, you're being unfair. You've had your time. Young people build their own lives. It's natural for the older generation to step aside. Step aside, I repeated. The words sat heavy on my tongue. Marissa leaned in, her voice smooth again. Exactly. You've done enough, Gloria. You've worked hard your whole life. You should rest. Enjoy what you have. I smiled faintly. Oh, I intend to. Her eyes narrowed, confused by my tone. Good. I'm glad we understand each other. I looked down at my water glass. The condensation had nearly dried. I ran my finger along the rim and said quietly, it's funny how people talk about respect like it's optional, as if it's something to be distributed when it's convenient. Marissa's mother frowned. Respect is earned. I looked up, my eyes meeting hers. Yes. And so is humility. The air shifted. Even the piano seemed to pause. Michael exhaled heavily. Mom, please, can we not do this right now? I turned to him. Do what? Tell the truth. Just don't make this worse. I smiled sadly. Oh, sweetheart. It's already worse than you think. I reached for my purse, stood and straightened my shoulders. Excuse me for a moment. Again, Marissa asked, trying to sound amused. You just went to the restroom. This time I said I'm not going to the restroom. She blinked, confused. Then where? I didn't answer. I turned and walked toward the kitchen hallway again, my heels clicking softly against the marble. Each step felt lighter than the last. Behind me I heard Marissa whisper, "What is she doing?" Michael's voice followed, uncertain. I don't know. I pushed open the kitchen door and slipped inside. The heat and the noise hit me instantly. Dario looked up from the counter. He didn't need to ask. Now, he said quietly. I nodded. Now. He wiped his hands, straightened his apron, and smiled a wolfish, satisfied smile. It will be my pleasure, Mrs. Matthews. I exhaled slowly, the weight of the evening finally beginning to lift. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt. I was ready. The sound of knives and pans behind me faded into rhythm again as I walked toward the door. My voice, steady and calm, floated over my shoulder. They wanted me to know my place, I said. It's time they learned it too. And with that, I stepped back into the dining room, where the lesson was waiting to be served. The kitchen door closed behind me with a soft thud, sealing away the laughter and chatter of the dining room. Inside, the world was alive, pans hissing, knives clattering, voices rising and falling in a familiar, frantic symphony. The air smelled like butter and rosemary and sweat. It smelled like my life. Steam curled up from the stovetops, catching the golden light of the overhead lamps. I could feel the pulse of the place through the soles of my shoes. This was my rhythm, my heartbeat, my sanctuary. I had built every inch of it from the ground up, the tiles, the counters, the menu, the people. And now this heartbeat would steady me for what came next. Mrs. Matthews, Dario said, stepping out from behind the line. His white jacket gleamed against the stainless steel, his black hair slicked back, his eyes sharp as always. You shouldn't be out there with them. I saw the way they looked at you. It took everything in me not to throw them out myself. I smiled faintly. You'll get your turn, Dario. He studied my face. So you're doing it tonight? Yes, I said. It's time. He nodded, wiping his hands on a towel. Then we'll do it properly. 3 minutes after I go back out there, I reminded him. He smirked. And I'll call you what I always do. Exactly. He laughed quietly, shaking his head. You've got ice in your veins, boss. Not ice, I said softly. Just patience. I walked farther into the kitchen, running my hand along the cool metal of the counter. The hum of the refrigerator vibrated against my fingertips. Luis was at the far end, chopping herbs with steady rhythm. When he saw me, he froze for a moment, knife hovering mid-air. Mrs. Matthews, he whispered. I didn't expect. It's all right, Luis, I said, lowering my voice. You've done well tonight. He smiled, the kind of smile that came from someone who'd been seen. For a moment, I just stood there watching my staff. These were my people. Not by blood, but by loyalty. The cooks, the dishwashers, the servers. Every one of them had earned their place here. I'd built this kitchen to be the kind of family I'd never had. A place where hard work mattered more than pedigree. Respect was our only currency. Dario joined me, his tone quieter now. You sure about this? Once you step out there, there's no going back. I nodded. There's nothing to go back to. He studied me, then nodded once. Then, let's make it count. I could feel the heat against my skin, the hum of the oven surrounding me like armor. My reflection flickered in the metal door of the oven, hair pinned tight, eyes steady, no fear left. They think I came here to eat, I said softly. They don't know I came here to remember who I am. Dario smiled. And who's that, ma'am? The woman who built this kitchen, I said. The woman who built them. He gave a small nod of respect. They won't see it coming. They never do, I said. That's the beauty of quiet people. Everyone mistakes silence for weakness until it becomes power. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The noise of the kitchen filled the silence for us. You remember when we opened this place? I asked suddenly. How could I forget? Dario said, laughing under his breath. You made me scrub every tile twice before we let the first customer in. You said it had to shine, like redemption. I smiled. It did. It still does, he said softly. You built something that lasts, Gloria. I built something worth protecting, I corrected. He looked at me for a long moment. Then let's go protect it. I nodded, but I didn't move yet. I needed a breath. I leaned against the counter, inhaling the scent of garlic and wine and citrus. Each aroma held a story, one of the nights I'd stayed late to balance the books. One of the mornings I'd arrived early to train new staff. One of the endless hours I'd poured into something that no one, not even my son, had cared to ask about. It didn't matter. Because tonight they would see it. Dario placed a hand on my shoulder just for a second. You know, when I first met you, I thought you were crazy, he said. You said you wanted a restaurant where respect was served before the food. I chuckled. And you thought it was impossible. I thought it was naive, he admitted. But you proved me wrong. I proved everyone wrong, I said. The kitchen doors swung open slightly as one of the servers passed through with a tray. Through the narrow gap, I could see the dining room again, Marissa's bright smile, her parents sipping wine, Michael looking lost. The glow of the chandelier shimmered like the surface of a frozen lake. So elegant, so hollow. I turned back to Dario. When I walk out there, give me 3 minutes. Then come find me. He nodded, his expression hardening. Understood. Say it clearly, I said. So there's no mistake. He straightened his posture, the authority returning to his voice. Yes, Mrs. Matthews. The words rang through the kitchen, slicing through the noise. The staff froze for a heartbeat, then resumed their work, moving faster, now sharper, as though the air itself had changed. They'd heard it too, the promise in that name. I straightened my shoulders and started toward the door. Before I pushed it open, I paused, looking back at my reflection in the metal once more. For the first time all night I smiled, not the polite kind I gave strangers, but the real one, the one that reached my eyes. They think I'm finished, I whispered. But this is just the beginning. Behind me, Dario called out, give them a show, boss. I pushed the door open and the kitchen light spilled into the hallway, fading into the dim glow of the dining room. My heels tapped against the floor in perfect rhythm with the slow piano melody playing overhead. As I walked past the tables, a few patrons looked up curious. To them, I was just an older woman in a gray dress moving gracefully through the restaurant. But to me, every inch of that floor was sacred ground. I stopped near the archway that separated the dining room from the private section. From there I could see them clearly. Marissa radiant and smug. Her parents composed and unaware. My son pretending to belong to their world. I waited, breathing in the scene like an actor before her cue. The waiter who'd served us earlier caught my eye again. Luis. He hesitated mid-step, then gave a small nod as if to say, I know. I smiled back. The sound of laughter rose from table 22, again loud and empty. 3 minutes, I reminded myself. I glanced toward the kitchen. Through the small circular window, I saw Dario's silhouette standing ready. It was almost time. I reached for the glass of water still waiting at my place, and lifted it. The ice had melted completely, leaving it lukewarm, flat, meaningless. I raised it slightly, just enough for the light to catch it, and whispered, to knowing my place. Then I set the glass down untouched. When I turned, the kitchen door swung open again, and the soft sound of Dario's footsteps filled the room. He stopped behind me, his voice clear and steady. Mrs. Matthews, pardon the interruption, he said, loud enough for the entire section to hear. There's a matter in the office that requires your attention. The words hung in the air like a blade. I turned slowly toward the table, my expression calm, my heart steady. And for the first time all evening, Marissa's perfect smile began to crack. The entire restaurant fell silent. Forks froze in mid-air, wineglasses paused halfway to lips. The music seemed to dim itself as Dario's words echoed through the dining room. Mrs. Matthews, pardon the interruption, but there's a matter in the office that requires your attention. Marissa's laughter died instantly. Her eyes darted between me and Dario, confusion flickering across her perfect face. Mrs. Matthews, she repeated, her voice a notch too high. Why did he call you that? I turned slowly to face her, the soft lighting catching on the silver pin of my dress. Because that's my name, I said calmly. Dario bowed slightly, his professional tone never faltering. Yes, ma'am. The staff needs you for a moment. It's about the delivery for tomorrow. Her father frowned, setting his glass down. Wait, what delivery? What's going on? I met his gaze and smiled faintly. He's doing his job, Mr. Carver, and so am I. Michael blinked, his voice trembling slightly. Mom, what's happening? Before I could answer, Dario spoke again, this time addressing the table. Mrs. Matthews is the owner of Marbella's, he said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. Everything you see here, every plate, every chandelier, every piece of art, belongs to her. The sound of silverware clattering against porcelain broke the silence. Marissa's mother gasped. Her father straightened in his seat, face paling. Michael stared at me like he was seeing a ghost. Owner, Marissa whispered, her face draining of color. You own this restaurant? Yes, I said, still composed. For the last 12 years. Marissa let out a breathy laugh, one that sounded almost hysterical. That's not possible. You said you worked in kitchens. You said you cleaned. I did, I replied. Every tile, every counter, every stove. That's how I learned what it takes to build something that lasts. Her father's voice cracked with disbelief. If this is true, why didn't you ever tell them? I turned to him, my tone even. Because I wanted to see who my son would become without my money. Without my name. Michael swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. You never told me. You never said anything. You never asked, I said quietly. The room had gone utterly still. Even the other diners were pretending not to listen, though every ear was tilted in our direction. Marissa's jaw tightened. You expect us to believe this? You expect us to believe that you dressed like that, own a place like this? Dario stepped forward, his expression cool but firm. Believe what you wish, ma'am. I've worked for Mrs. Matthews since the day she opened this place. She built it from nothing. Every staff member here knows it. The waiter, Luis, approached cautiously, holding a tray. His voice trembled, but his words were clear. It's true. Mrs. Matthews is the reason we all have jobs here. Marissa stared at them, then at me, then back at them again. This is insane. It's reality, I said, cutting her off gently. Something you've spent so long decorating that you've forgotten how to see it. Her father's voice turned sharp. If you had all this money, all this success, why live so small? Why let us think you were poor? I looked him straight in the eye. Because the way people treat you when they think you have nothing tells you everything you need to know about who they are. Michael flinched, as if struck. Mom, please, he said softly. You didn't mean to let her starve me at my own table, I asked. My voice wasn't angry, only tired. You didn't mean to let your wife humiliate me in front of her family. He stared down at his hands, his fingers tightening around the napkin until it tore. I was trying to keep peace, he whispered. Peace, I said, my voice soft but heavy. Peace built on silence isn't peace, Michael. It's cowardice. Marissa's mother reached for her wine glass, hands trembling. I don't think we should discuss this here, I turned to her. Why not? You were quite comfortable discussing me here half an hour ago. Her face flushed. That's different. It always is, I said. The other tables had stopped pretending now. The restaurant had turned into an audience. Dario stood beside me, tall and still like a sentinel. My staff had begun to gather discreetly near the kitchen doors. I could feel their eyes on me, not pity, not shock, just pride. Marissa tried to compose herself, dabbing at her lips with a napkin that trembled in her hand. I don't understand why you'd hide something like this. If I had that kind of success, I'd live like it. I smiled. Yes, I know. That's the difference between us. She glared at me, her voice sharpening. You've made your point, Gloria. You wanted to embarrass us. Congratulations. You've succeeded. This isn't about embarrassment, I said evenly. It's about revelation. You wanted to remind me of my place. I'm simply returning the favor. Her father pushed back his chair and stood. I think we should leave. Dario's tone remained polite but unyielding. You're welcome to leave any time, sir. The bill has already been settled. $780, including Mrs. Matthews's glass of water. Her father froze. Marissa's mouth fell open. You charged us for the table you used to humiliate my employer, Dario said smoothly. Yes, ma'am. We charge for everything here. I almost laughed. Almost. Michael stood abruptly, eyes wide. Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I looked at him, really looked at him. The boy who once promised to take care of me, the man who now couldn't even look me in the eye. You didn't need to know, I said quietly. You just needed to be kind. He reached for me, but I stepped back. Please, he said, his voice cracking. Don't walk away. I'm not walking away, Michael, I said. You are. You have been for years. Marissa tried to speak, her voice wobbling. This doesn't change anything. We're still family. I met her gaze and smiled faintly. No, dear. This changes everything. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. I turned slightly to Dario. Thank you, I said. He bowed his head. Always, ma'am. I faced them one last time. Family doesn't humiliate. Family doesn't belittle. Family doesn't measure love in dollars or wine lists. You called this a dinner to reconnect. But the truth is, this was an execution. The only thing you forgot was who you invited to the table." No one spoke. Marissa's mother lowered her eyes. Her father's jaw clenched. Michael stood, frozen, tears beginning to fill his eyes. I picked up my purse and placed a folded napkin beside my empty glass. "Keep the water," I said quietly. "It's all I needed." Then I turned toward the entrance. As I walked through the restaurant, every pair of eyes followed. The waiters stepped aside, murmuring, "Good evening, Mrs. Matthews," as I passed. The pianist, seeing me leave, changed the melody to something softer, slower, something like "Grace." When I reached the door, I glanced over my shoulder. Marissa sat slumped in her chair, pale and small beneath all her polish. Her parents were whispering urgently to each other. Michael stood staring after me, his face broken open with regret. I gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not forgiveness, just acknowledgement. Then I pushed the door open and stepped into the cold night air. Outside, the city was quiet, the sky washed in silver and blue. I breathed deeply, the chill cutting clean through my chest. For the first time in years, I felt weightless. They had come to teach me my place. Instead, they'd learned who really owned it. The dining room stayed frozen long after I left. The silence stretched thick and suffocating, only broken by the faint clinking of a glass somewhere across the room. Marissa sat stiffly in her chair, her perfect posture beginning to collapse under the weight of her own reflection. Her mother's face had gone pale. Her father's jaw was locked. And Michael? Michael just stood there, staring at the doorway, like he could still see me walking through it. Dario remained at the edge of the table, silent, his presence towering in quiet judgment. It wasn't rage that filled the space, it was shame. Heavy, suffocating shame that couldn't be dressed up in pearls or softened by fine wine. Marissa finally broke the silence. "This is absurd," she said, forcing a shaky laugh. "She's trying to humiliate us. All of this, some kind of act." Dario raised an eyebrow. "An act." His tone was calm, but the sharpness underneath it cut through her words. "I've worked for Mrs. Matthews for 12 years. She built this place with her own hands. There's no act here, ma'am, just the truth." Her father shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Enough," he muttered. "We're leaving." But Michael didn't move. His hands trembled slightly as he ran them through his hair. "She owns it," he whispered, as if saying it out loud might make it easier to understand. All this time, Marissa turned on him. "So what? What difference does it make? She stopped herself, catching her mother's warning glance. "She's still her," she finished lamely. Michael's voice cracked. "She's my mother." "Michael," her father said sternly, "your mother should have told you the truth years ago. It was deceitful keeping something like this from her family." Michael looked up sharply. "Deceitful? You humiliated her, you let her sit here with nothing but a glass of water in front of her. And she didn't even flinch." Marissa's mother tried to soothe him. "Darling, emotions are high. No one meant to offend her, you didn't mean to." His voice rose. "Then what do you call what just happened?" The waiter appeared awkwardly at the corner, unsure whether to clear the table or disappear. His young face flushed with discomfort as he caught Michael's glare and hurried away. Marissa crossed her arms, defensive now. "Don't talk to me like I'm the villain here, Michael. I didn't know she was hiding money. If she wanted respect, she should have." He slammed his hand on the table. "Respect isn't earned through money," the sound echoed, drawing stares from nearby diners. Marissa flinched but didn't back down. "Then what is it earned through? Pity, obligation. You can't expect me to pretend she fits into our lives when she doesn't even try." Michael stared at her in disbelief. "Doesn't try? She spent her entire life giving everything to me. You think those dinners, those vacations, that education paid for themselves? She scrubbed floors and washed dishes to give me a life she never had." Marissa's mother spoke softly, as though handling a fragile truth. "Michael, dear, I'm sure your mother made sacrifices, but at some point people have to move forward." He looked at her, his expression hollow. "Forward into what? Pretending she doesn't exist?" Marissa rolled her eyes. "You're being dramatic." "No," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "I've been blind." He pushed back his chair and stood. The restaurant had grown quiet again. He looked down at Marissa, who stared back at him with thinly veiled panic. "You told her she wasn't family," he said. "You told her she embarrassed you." Marissa's lips parted. You told her she didn't belong at her own table." His words shook now, but not with anger, with guilt. "And I said nothing." Marissa stood, quickly grabbing his arm. "Stop making a scene. You're overreacting." He pulled away. "No, I'm finally reacting." Her father stood too, trying to regain control. "Michael, let's take this outside." But Michael's eyes were glassy, distant. "She built everything," he said, his voice breaking. "And I let you all tear her apart for it." The words hung between them, and for a long moment no one spoke. Marissa looked around, realizing the entire room had become an audience. Whispers rippled through the tables. The power she'd once wielded in her perfect tone and designer smile was gone. She looked small, trapped in the golden light she had loved so much. Her mother touched her shoulder. "We should go." Marissa jerked away. "No. I won't let her make me the bad guy." Dario cleared his throat softly. "Ma'am, you don't need help to do that." The line landed like a knife. Marissa turned on him, eyes burning. "You don't talk to me that way." He didn't blink. "I talk to everyone with respect. You might try it sometime." Marissa's father exhaled sharply, pulling out his wallet and slamming a handful of bills on the table. "Let's go." But Michael didn't move. He stood there, staring down at the chair where I'd sat. The empty glass of water gleamed in front of him, catching the chandelier's reflection. It looked pure and cruel at the same time. He reached for it, fingers trembling, and whispered, "She didn't even drink it." Marissa scoffed. "Because she wanted attention." He turned toward her slowly, his expression hollow. "No. Because she didn't need what we were offering." Her face fell. "Michael." He shook his head, his eyes wet now. "You'll never understand. You see people as props. You think respect is something you grant to make yourself look kind. But it's not. It's something you give because it's right." Marissa's voice cracked. "I was trying to protect us." From what he demanded. From humility, from decency. She said nothing. He turned toward Dario. Tell her I'm sorry." Dario inclined his head. "She already knows, sir. But she's not waiting for words. She's waiting for actions." Michael nodded slowly, then walked out. The heavy door swung behind him, the sound echoing through the room like a closing chapter. Marissa stood frozen for a moment, her body rigid, her eyes wide. Then she sank back into her chair, her hands shaking. Her father placed a hand on her shoulder, but she pulled away. "I just wanted them to see we were better," she whispered. Her mother looked at her sadly. "And now they see who we really are." No one spoke after that. The restaurant gradually returned to life, forks clinking, soft conversations resuming, but the air had changed, the glamour, the illusion had vanished. Dario gathered the remaining plates quietly. As he passed their table, he paused. "Mrs. Matthews built this place so no one would ever feel small under another person's roof," he said softly. "You might want to remember that next time you sit at someone else's table." He walked away without waiting for a response. Marissa lowered her head, the chandelier's light scattering across the table, illuminating every flaw in the perfect evening she'd tried to create. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the polished surface of her empty wineglass, and for the first time she didn't like what she saw. Outside, Michael stood on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, staring at the glow of the restaurant through the window. The woman inside, the one who had raised him, sacrificed for him, and sat in silence while he let others mock her, had just taught him more about power than any degree or salary ever could. He took a deep breath, wiped his face, and whispered into the cold night, "I'll make it right, Mom. I swear I will." And for the first time in years, he meant it. The morning after the dinner, the city was gray and quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm has torn through and left nothing the same. I woke before the alarm, the sound of rain against the window steady and soft. My body felt heavy, but my mind was still. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, listening to the rhythm of water, letting it fill the silence that used to be Michael's voice in my head. I didn't dream that night. There was nothing left to dream about. Everything that needed to be said had been said. Everything that needed to break had already broken. At 7, my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't expected to see so soon, Michael. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times, then watched it go silent. A few seconds later, a message appeared. Mom, I'm sorry. Please, can we talk? I didn't know how blind I'd been until last night. I set the phone face down on the table. Some words didn't deserve an answer, not yet. Regret was easy to type. Change took time. I made coffee, the smell grounding me. Outside, the rain thickened, blurring the skyline into smudges of silver. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the empty chair across from me. It used to be Michael's spot when he was little. He'd sit there with his legs swinging, waiting for pancakes before school. I used to think love meant giving and never keeping anything for yourself. But love that isn't respected turns into something else: duty, habit, sometimes even pain. A knock came at the door around 9. 3 short taps, hesitant. I didn't move right away. When I finally opened it, Michael was standing there, soaked through, eyes red, his suit jacket clinging to his shoulders. Mom, he said softly. Can I come in? I stepped aside. You're already here. He walked in slowly, like he was afraid of breaking something. The smell of rain clung to him. He stood awkwardly near the table, glancing at the coffee pot. You still make it the same way, he said, trying to smile. Some things don't need changing, I replied. Sit. He obeyed, hands clasped tightly in front of him. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the clock ticking above the stove. I don't know where to start, he said finally. Try the truth, I said. He swallowed hard. I let her talk to you that way. I let them treat you like you didn't matter. I thought staying quiet meant keeping peace. But all I did was prove how little spine I had. I didn't interrupt. He needed to hear his own words more than I did. I thought success meant distance, he continued. That the further I got from where I came from, the better I was doing. But last night, when Dario said your name, when everyone looked at you like they finally saw you, I realized I didn't even know who you were anymore. I met his eyes. You didn't want to. He nodded slowly, tears starting to gather. You're right. I didn't. Because if I had, I'd have to face what I'd become. The rain hit harder against the window. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, trying to keep himself together. I'm sorry, he whispered. Not because you have money, not because you own that restaurant, but because I forgot who you are. You're my mother. You're the reason I have anything. And I treated you like a burden. I leaned back in my chair. Apologies are the easy part, Michael. Change is the hard one. He nodded. Then I'll change. I don't care what it takes. I studied him for a long moment. You can't erase what happened. You can only decide what you'll do with it. He reached across the table, but I didn't move. Mom, please, he said softly. Don't shut me out. I'm not shutting you out, I said. I'm giving you space to grow into someone I can trust again. His eyes dropped to his hands. And Marissa, what about her? She's furious. Her parents told her she embarrassed them. They're threatening to cut us off financially. I raised an eyebrow. Maybe that's the best thing that could happen to you. He looked startled. How can you say that? Because you've been living on borrowed pride, I said. When someone's money defines your worth, you stop belonging to yourself. Maybe now you'll finally remember who you are. He stared at me, the realization dawning like a slow sunrise. I don't even know where to start. Start with respect, I said. For yourself, for others, for the people you think are beneath you. Respect is the only currency that never loses value. He nodded, his shoulders trembling. I understand. Do you? I asked quietly. Because last night I saw a man I didn't recognize. The boy I raised would have stood up even if his voice shook. The man I saw lowered his head to keep his seat at someone else's table. He covered his face with his hands, his voice breaking. I know. And I hate myself for it. I sighed softly, my anger finally cooling into something gentler, sadder. Don't hate yourself. Learn from yourself. That's the only way it means something. He lifted his head, eyes red. Will you ever forgive me? Forgiveness isn't a door you knock on, Michael, I said. It's one you build yourself. When it's strong enough, I'll walk through it. He nodded slowly, understanding. When he left an hour later, he looked smaller but lighter. The rain had stopped and the air smelled clean again. He turned back at the doorway, his voice quiet. You're right, Mom. You always were. I smiled faintly. Then prove it. After the door closed, I stood still for a long time. The house felt different now, not emptier but freer. At noon, I drove to Marbella's. The sky had cleared, a strip of pale sunlight breaking through the clouds. When I walked inside, Dario was waiting near the bar. Morning, boss, he said, smiling. I didn't expect you so soon. Work doesn't stop for revelations, I said. He laughed. No, it doesn't. We walked through the restaurant together, checking the tables, the lighting, the kitchen. Everything was spotless. The staff greeted me quietly, respectfully, some still whispering about the night before. Word travels fast in a place like this. When we reached my office, Dario lingered at the door. You handled it perfectly, you know, he said. I looked at him. There's no perfect way to break your own heart. He nodded. Maybe not. But you did it with grace. I sat down at my desk and stared at the framed photo of Michael on his graduation day. His arms were around me in that picture, both of us smiling, both of us believing that love was enough. People grow, I said quietly. Sometimes they grow away before they find their way back. Dario hesitated. And if he doesn't come back, then I'll still have peace, I said. That's more than I had yesterday. He smiled. Peace suits you, Mrs. Matthews. When he left, I opened the ledger on my desk. Pages filled with numbers, plans, and notes stared back at me. I turned to a clean page and wrote a single line at the top. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you teach before you go. Outside, the restaurant came alive again, the sounds of laughter, plates, and life returning. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt free. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, letting the steady hum of the restaurant wash over me. Somewhere out there, my son was learning what it meant to stand tall again. And for the first time, I knew that whether or not he ever found his way back, I had already found mine. The days that followed passed quietly, but the quiet wasn't empty, it was steady, deliberate, healing. Each morning I woke early, opened the blinds, and watched the sunlight move slowly across my kitchen floor. There were no phone calls from Marissa, no apologies from her parents, no awkward invitations pretending to fix what couldn't be fixed. Only one message from Michael, simple and short. I'm working on it. That was all it said. And it was enough for now. I spent my mornings at the restaurant again, not because I needed to, but because it grounded me. The staff greeted me warmly, more respectfully than ever, but not with pity. They'd all heard what happened that night. News like that travels faster than steam in a kitchen. Yet there was no gossip, no whispers, only quiet pride. Dario met me by the front window one afternoon, polishing a wine glass. You know, he said, I've seen a lot of people eat humble pie in this place, but never quite like that. I smiled faintly. It wasn't about revenge, Dario. It was about truth. Revenge fades. Truth stays. He nodded thoughtfully. Still, I bet it tasted better than any dessert on the menu. I couldn't help but laugh. Maybe a little. The bell above the door rang, then a sound I'd come to recognize as the start of something unexpected. I looked up and my heart paused for just a second. Standing there was Michael holding a small paper bag, looking both older and younger than I remembered. Afternoon, he said awkwardly. Dario smiled politely and disappeared into the kitchen. Afternoon, I replied. You look tired. He nodded. I haven't been sleeping much. Marissa moved out 2 nights ago. Took Chloe to her parents. I didn't stop her. I gestured for him to sit. Sometimes silence says everything words can't. He sat across from me, the same table where he used to eat fries and drink chocolate milk while I balanced the books. He placed the bag on the table and slid it toward me. It's just a sandwich, he said, embarrassed. I didn't know if you'd had lunch. The gesture was small, but it was something. I unwrapped it, a simple turkey sandwich, too much mustard, the bread uneven. It was perfect. Thank you, I said softly. He watched me for a moment, nervous. I went by your apartment yesterday, but you weren't home. I wanted to talk, but I didn't want to bother you. You're not bothering me, I said. I was at the market, buying flowers for the restaurant. He glanced toward the window where vases of bright yellow lilies caught the light. You always loved those, he said. They remind me that something beautiful can grow even after being cut down, I replied. He looked down at his hands. Mom, I don't know how to make this right. Every time I try to think of what to say, it sounds small compared to what I did. Then don't say it, I said. Show it. He nodded slowly. I'm trying. I quit the job. That surprised me. You did what I quit, he said again. I couldn't stand it anymore. That place, those people, they all cared about the same thing Marissa's parents did. Image, money, not value. And what will you do now? I asked. I don't know, he admitted. But whatever it is, I want to earn it myself. For a moment, I saw him as he used to be, the boy with scuffed shoes, who promised to buy me a big house someday, who believed hard work could change everything. Somewhere along the way, that boy had gotten lost in other people's expectations. Maybe now he was finding his way back. He exhaled slowly, his voice quieter now. Chloe keeps asking about you. She drew you a picture. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper. It was a crayon drawing stick figures holding hands under a big yellow sun. In the corner she'd written Grandma Glow in crooked letters. My throat tightened. She remembered me. She never forgot you, he said softly. Marissa wanted her to, but she wouldn't. She cried when we told her you wouldn't be at dinner anymore. I traced the lines of the drawing with my fingertips. She's a good girl. She takes after you, he said. We sat in silence for a while, both lost in thought. Outside, people passed by with umbrellas, the city alive in its own rhythm. Mom, he said, finally I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to earn your respect again. Whatever it takes. I looked at him steadily. Respect isn't something you buy or win back with grand gestures. It's in the small things, how you speak to people, how you carry yourself when no one's watching. He nodded. Then I'll start there. After a pause, I asked, what about Marissa? He sighed. She called yesterday. Said her parents think she should reevaluate her choices. I told her, maybe that's the first smart thing they've said. I smiled faintly. You sound like your father when you say things like that. He looked surprised. You never talk about him. There's not much to say, I said simply. He taught me one thing though. That love without respect is a slow kind of poison. I drank it for years before I learned the difference. Michael was quiet for a long time. Then he said softly, I think I've been drinking the same thing. Then stop, I said. You can't rebuild anything while you're still swallowing what's killing you. He let out a shaky laugh. You always know how to put things. It comes with age, I said. And pain. He looked around the restaurant, then his eyes softening. You really built this from nothing. Not nothing, I corrected. From necessity. From hunger. From wanting to create a place where people were fed in more ways than one. He nodded, admiration flickering across his face. You did it. You really did. I looked around too. The golden light, the polished tables, the laughter from the kitchen, it was all mine. But it wasn't pride that filled me. It was peace. You can do it too, I said quietly. Just remember who you are when no one else is clapping. He smiled sadly. I wish I'd learned that sooner. It's not too late, I said. The only time it's too late is when you stop trying. He reached across the table, hesitated, then took my hand. His grip was warm, hesitant, like a child testing if the door to home was still open. I don't deserve your forgiveness yet, he said. Then earn it, I said. Day by day. He nodded again, his eyes shining. I will. After he left, I sat there for a long time holding the crayon drawing. The rain had stopped and a shaft of sunlight spilled through the window, lighting the edge of the paper. The stick figures looked small but unbreakable, hand in hand beneath the bright yellow sun. For the first time I didn't feel alone. I folded the drawing carefully and placed it in my purse. Then I stood, straightened my jacket, and looked around my restaurant one more time. Life had a way of circling back, of forcing you to face the same table, the same people, the same choices, but with new eyes. And I was finally ready to look. 2 months later, spring came to the city like forgiveness after a long winter, slow, hesitant, but real. The trees outside Marbella's bloomed in pale pinks and whites, their petals scattered along the sidewalk like confetti from a celebration no one announced. Inside the restaurant was full again, laughter and clinking glasses filling the space that had once held silence and humiliation. I stood near the entrance, greeting guests as they arrived. It was something I hadn't done in years. I used to hide in my office or the kitchen, but now I liked being here, seeing faces, hearing voices, watching people connect over food. It reminded me that what I built wasn't just a restaurant, it was a place where people remembered their humanity. Dario appeared beside me with his usual calm smile. "Full house again, boss," he said. "The mayor's table called ahead. They want the chef's tasting menu." "Good," I said. "Tell Luis to take care of them personally. He's earned it." "He'll be thrilled," Dario said. Then his tone softened. "You seem lighter these days." I smiled faintly. "I stopped carrying what wasn't mine." He nodded approvingly. "That's a good habit to keep." The bell above the door rang again, and when I turned, I froze for half a second. Michael stood there holding Chloe's tiny hand. She was in a yellow dress, her dark curls bouncing as she looked around the restaurant with wide, curious eyes. Dario caught my eye and quietly disappeared into the kitchen, leaving us alone. "Hi, Mom," Michael said softly. "Hi," I replied, my voice calm but warm. Chloe tugged on his hand. "Daddy, is this Grandma Glow's place?" Michael smiled down at her. "Yes, sweetheart. This is her place." She turned to me, her eyes bright. "It's so pretty. It smells like pancakes and flowers." I laughed, kneeling to her level. "You have a good nose. And I think you've grown a little since I last saw you." She giggled. "Daddy says I grow every day." "Smart man," I said, glancing up at Michael. He looked thinner, but stronger somehow. His eyes didn't carry that hollow guilt anymore, just sincerity. "We wanted to stop by," he said. "Chloe's been asking to see you every day." "I'm glad you came," I said softly. "Both of you." We sat at a small table near the window, one that caught the late afternoon light. Chloe colored quietly with crayons. Dario brought her humming to herself. Michael leaned forward, his tone steady. "I wanted you to know, I've been working again, at a local community center, helping small businesses manage their finances. It's not glamorous, but it feels right." "It sounds honest," I said. "That's worth more than glamorous." He smiled faintly. "I thought about what you said. About earning things the right way. I'm trying." "I can see that," I said. He hesitated. "I didn't come for forgiveness. I came to say thank you." "For what?" "For letting me fall. For not rescuing me from my own choices. You could have bought me a better life years ago, but instead you gave me the chance to build one myself." I exhaled slowly, my chest tightening in the best kind of way. "You sound like the boy I used to raise." He laughed softly. Maybe he never really left. He just got buried under too much noise. We watched Chloe draw for a while, her crayons scratching across the paper. She looked up suddenly and held out her picture, a sun, a house, and 3 stick figures. "This is us," she said proudly. "Grandma, Daddy, and me. We're having dinner together." I smiled, my throat thickening. "It's beautiful, sweetheart." Michael's eyes shimmered. "She's been saying that's all she wants. Dinner with her grandma." I looked at him. "Then let's not disappoint her." We ordered simple things, grilled salmon, mashed potatoes, and Chloe's favorite strawberry cheesecake. It wasn't a grand dinner, not like the one that broke us. It was warm, quiet, human. We ate slowly, talked softly, and laughed more than I expected. At one point, Chloe dipped her finger in whipped cream and smeared it on Michael's nose. He pretended to be horrified and she squealed with laughter. The sound filled the restaurant, light and contagious. For a moment, I forgot the pain, the humiliation, the long nights wondering where I'd gone wrong. Maybe I hadn't gone wrong. Maybe I'd just taken the long road to teach the right lesson. When dinner was over, Chloe leaned across the table, resting her chin on her hands. "Grandma," she said, "Daddy says you own this whole place." "Is that true?" "Yes, honey," I said with a smile. "It's my restaurant." Her eyes widened. "Wow, you're like the boss of everyone," I chuckled. "Something like that." Michael smiled. "She tells everyone she wants to be like you when she grows up." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and what's that?" strong Chloe said proudly. "Daddy says you're strong and kind. That's what I want to be." My heart softened completely. I reached across the table and touched her small hand. "Then, you already are, sweetheart." As they got ready to leave, Michael stood awkwardly by the door. "Mom," he said, his voice quiet, "I don't know if we'll ever erase what happened. But I promise I'll spend the rest of my life making sure Chloe grows up knowing what love and respect really mean." I nodded, smiling gently. "That's all the forgiveness I need." He looked like he wanted to say more, but instead he pulled me into a hug, tight, genuine, trembling. For a long time we just stood there, mother and son, the noise of the restaurant fading around us. When they left, Chloe turned at the door and waved. "Bye, Grandma, don't forget our picture." I held up the drawing and waved back. "Never." The door closed softly behind them, the bell chiming once. Dario appeared beside me again, leaning against the counter. "You all right?" he asked. I looked at the crayon drawing in my hand, the sun, the house, the 3 stick figures. It wasn't perfect. The lines were crooked, the colors too bright. But it was real. "I'm better than all, right?" I said. "I'm finally home." He smiled. "Then, maybe now, you can rest." "Maybe," I said, glancing around the restaurant one last time. The golden light glowed against the walls, soft and forgiving. "But I don't think I'll ever stop building." Dario chuckled. "Some people build for profit. You build for peace." I smiled. Peace pays better in the long run. Later that night, after the last guest had left, I locked the doors and walked through the quiet dining room. Every table gleamed. Every chair was perfectly aligned. I stopped at table 22, the same one where it all began, and ran my hand over the polished surface. It no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like closure. I whispered softly, "Know your place," and this time it didn't sting. It felt like a promise. Because now I truly did know my place. It wasn't in the shadows. It wasn't in silence. It was here at the heart of what I had built, surrounded by warmth, laughter, and truth. As I turned off the lights, the reflection of the chandelier shimmered against the window, bright and unbroken. I walked toward the door, Chloe's drawing folded gently in my hand. Before stepping out into the night, I whispered one last thing to myself, the words, quiet but certain. "Love without respect isn't love. And I'll never settle for less again." Then I smiled, locked the door behind me, and stepped into the cool night air. The world outside was still, but inside me, everything was alive again. And if anyone watching that night had asked what lesson my story carried, I would have told them this: dignity is not something others grant you, it's something you reclaim. So, if you're listening to this, if you've ever been made to feel small, remember, your worth isn't up for debate. Stand tall, speak softly, and let your silence build empires. Because sometimes the quietest revenge is simply living well. And if my story meant something to you, leave a comment below, share it, subscribe, and stay. There are more stories like this about strength, redemption, and the quiet kind of justice that changes everything.